according to the analysis we're digging into today, the spark was a pretty dramatic confrontation out on the open ocean, dated December 7th, 2026.
Yeah, the source we're looking at is, let's just say, not pulling any punches. It quotes Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who frames this whole seizure not as some routine military operation, but as you can see, as literal piracy.
So, what exactly went down? Well, the U.S. military chased down and seized this Russian-flagged tanker, saying it was carrying sanctioned oil from Venezuela. But here's the twist. According to the source, the tanker was reportedly empty.
First of all, I'm not sure they're going to find much on the tanker. The latest reports I've heard is that the tanker was empty. So, I don't know what they plan to do at that point. This was part of the so-called shadow fleet, which has been a thorn in the side of the neocons and others in Washington who want to enforce the sanctions against Russia. I think this is potentially one of the last nails in the coffin of any sort of resumption of good relations with Russia. I think instead, President Trump, who from time to time has conveyed the impression, at least, that he wanted a normalization of relations with Moscow, has now turned in a very different direction. And all of his efforts with Witkoff and Kushner and others have failed miserably. I don't know what they expect to get out of anything by seizing this particular vessel. The Russians are not fools. They're not going to go to war over one empty tanker. There's no question about that. But the fact that we chose to ignore its flag, it actually violated international law. I don't think this helps us. I don't think it improves the situation for us with Russia. We seem to have lost all interest in coming to some sort of resolution of the Ukraine conflict. I don't think the Russians or the Chinese or anyone else is going to challenge us in the Southern Caribbean. So I think most of the damage to us from this behavior will have an effect inside Latin America. Everyone in Latin America is watching what's happening and has reached the worst possible conclusions about us. Many people who otherwise might be sympathetic to us because of our opposition to the drug cartels and the human trafficking are now, I think, largely opposed to us.
And look, it's not just about the oil. That's a huge misconception. The source argues that the real prize is, well, all of this. We're talking gold, iron, rare earth minerals, a huge treasure trove of natural resources.
Remember that there are also gold mines, iron ore mines, emerald mines, rare earths, bauxite, copper, a lot of different things. We want to get our hands on all of those things as well, but much of that is in the interior. The interior of Venezuela looks like the highlands of Vietnam, triple canopy jungle. It's enormous inside, and the transportation infrastructure is not very well developed. Most of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, when they established them, they built along the rivers, and what roads they built ran to the coast from the interior. Well, there are very few of those, but that's about it. In other words, there's no developed transportation infrastructure across Venezuela. Then you have the probability of some resistance. An awful lot of weapons have been distributed inside Venezuela to all of Maduro's supporters. I think if we were to go in there militarily, it would end up being one giant ambush.
Okay, so beyond the geopolitics, the analysis says we have to do what they always say, follow the money. It points to some very powerful financial interests as the real engine behind this whole Venezuela strategy. This term, vulture capitalist, is really central to the argument here. The idea is that you have investors who specialize in profiting from chaos and failure. They buy up assets for pennies on the dollar when things go bad. And the analysis suggests that people like this don't just stand to gain from instability, they might have the influence to help create it. And that leads to this really powerful phrase the analysis uses, legalized grift. The idea is that the system is set up in a way that allows people with the right connections to get incredibly rich from foreign policy decisions that affect entire countries. And to really drive this point home, the source uses this amazing historical story. It's about American diplomats way back in Napoleon's day who were offered a personal gift of gold after a major deal. They flat out refused, calling it what it was, a bribe. The story is meant to show just how much things have supposedly changed in Washington. Okay, so let's zoom out because according to this analysis, none of this is happening in a stable world. It's all happening while the global system as we know it is, well, falling apart.
This slide really lays out the argument about NATO. On one side, you have the reason it was created in the first place, a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. But on the other side, you have what the source claims it's become today, a tool that pulls European nations into conflicts far from home that they have no real stake in.
And it's not just NATO. The analysis paints this really bleak picture of a world where all the major institutions are basically crumbling. NATO, the EU, it argues they're all falling apart, and that some powerful players in Washington are more interested in profiting from the collapse than trying to fix it.
Everything is literally disintegrating. We can't put it back together again, and no one is looking at what we can do in the future. They're only focused on how do we profit from the disintegration in the best ways possible. And I think that's Washington. Washington is all about money. I hate to be blunt, but unless you're going to show up and you have lots of money, not very many people are going to pay a great deal of attention to you. The notion that there is some sort of altruistic purpose behind what happens in Washington is absurd.
So that brings us to the big, scary question. What's next? If the world order is falling apart, how is the U.S. positioned to handle it? Well, according to the source, not well. Not well at all.
This is a really blunt assessment. The source is basically saying that the United States is simply not ready for a major war with a great power like Russia or China, and it's definitely not prepared to fight both at the same time. And check out this number, 2 to 3. It might seem small, but according to the source, it represents a massive logistical problem. It's the ratio of defense missiles Israel apparently has to use for every single incoming missile. The analysis argues there's just no way the U.S. could sustain that kind of burn rate in a big war. And this final comparison, man, it's a powerful one. It puts the U.S. and China side by side. On one hand, you have the U.S., which was this manufacturing powerhouse back in World War II, but now, the source claims, makes almost nothing besides military gear. And you compare that to China, which the source says is basically where the U.S. was back in 1943.
And remember, China now has the largest manufacturing base in the world. China, in many ways, is where we were in 1943, 44, and 45 during World War II. We went from, I would say, 40 miles per hour to 150 in the space of a few hours, if you want an analogy. And that huge explosion in manufacturing capability came about for many reasons, but the point is when the war ended, we were able to turn that around and make the manufacturing base as effective in the commercial sector as it had been in the military sector. And we've lived on that manufacturing base into the 80s when we began exporting it. So today we manufacture almost nothing. And most of what we do manufacture is military equipment. Now, China is in a very different position. As I said, they're where we were. They're really exploding globally. They probably account for 50% of world gross domestic product. They're keeping the world afloat, if you will. Things would be much worse for us if it were not for China. So I don't know if the Chinese will continue to play with us, play ball with us, so to say. At some point, they say, shed the debt, dump the treasuries, the hell with it. And, what does that do to us? What our supply chain access is already diminished because supply chains have oriented away from us and towards China.
So when you put it all together, the analysis we've walked through paints a pretty intense picture. It suggests a system that's driven by profit facing total disintegration. And it leaves us with this final massive question. If this analysis is even close to being right, what happens when the old order finally completely breaks?